The Vietnam conflict is a tale of tragedy, controversy and heartache, one that left a mark on American history and shaped an entire generation. From the unprecedented media coverage to the widespread distrust of the government, it's no surprise that this chapter in US history is still discussed and debated to this day. But to truly understand the gravity of America's defeat in Vietnam, we must first delve into the country's past rule under the French. In the late 19th century, the European colonisers decided to call the region comprising of modern-day Laos, Cambodia and Vietnam as Indochina, simply because it was sandwiched between India and China, and with that, the French swiftly and decisively established themselves in the region, quelling any uprising and forcing local rulers to cooperate with their colonial administrators. However, during World War II, France were occupied by Germany, leaving their colony undefended, and Japan seized the opportunity to take control. Some initially saw the Japanese as Asian liberators, but they were soon disillusioned by the regime's brutality. During their rule, Japan treated Vietnam brutally. They imposed strict controls over the Vietnamese economy and plundered the country's resources, and forced the Vietnamese to work in labour camps or serve in the Japanese military. The Japanese also implemented harsh policies aimed at suppressing Vietnamese culture and identity, such as banning the use of the Vietnamese language in schools and government offices. The cruelty and repression done by the Japanese during the occupation of Vietnam contributed to the widespread hatred and resistance against their rule. Once the Allies secured victory in 1945, the French returned to Indochina and were welcomed back surprisingly with open arms, especially by the Vietnam Independence League led by exiled intellectual Ho Chi Minh, coined this name due to its meaning of bright spirit who was staunchly anti-colonialist. The United States now found itself in a tricky situation when it came to Vietnam. On one hand, they had supported the Viet Minh against the Japanese during World War II. On the other hand, French stability was seen as crucial in preventing communism from spreading into the Southeast Asia. Despite pleas for assistance from the French during the 1940s and 50s, the US ultimately decided not to send troops to Vietnam. However, after the split of the country between North and South Vietnam in 1954, fighting broke out once again. President Kennedy, like his predecessor Eisenhower, was hesitant to send American troops to Vietnam. However, after Kennedy's assassination in 1963, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson, seeing the threat of communism in Asia, ramped up US involvement. In the summer of 1964, 2 US ships were allegedly attacked by communist forces in the Gulf of Tonkin, and Congress soon gave President Johnson the authority to send US troops. By early 1965, thousands of American soldiers were deployed in Vietnam, ready to fight against the well-trained and experienced Southern Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army. One of the key factors in America's defeat was the unconventional tactics employed by the North Vietnamese Army, the NVA, and the Viet Cong. While US generals led the American army with a strictly attrition-based defensive strategy, the NVA and Viet Cong relied upon guerrilla tactics and avoided direct confrontations whenever possible, similar to the fighting the US experienced against the Japanese in the Pacific. The US attempted to wage a conventional war similar to what they had done in Korea, but this proved to be ineffective against the highly mobile and unidentifiable Viet Cong. The Viet Cong, also known as Southern insurgents, employed a unique style of fighting during the Vietnam War that proved to be highly effective against the United States military. They employed guerrilla tactics such as ambushes, booby traps and hit-and-run attacks to harass and disrupt the US troops. They relied upon their knowledge of the terrain to evade the US forces. They also employed an extensive network of tunnels and underground bunkers that allowed them to move undetected and launch surprise attacks. The Viet Cong's elusive tactics frustrated the US soldiers, making it difficult for them to engage in conventional warfare. and effectively eroded the morale of the American troops. The Viet Cong strategy was to wear down the US military through a prolonged bloody conflict and ultimately win the hearts and minds of the South Vietnamese people. Success was measured by body counts. But the more bombs that were dropped and the more people that were killed, the more support the North gained. On the other hand, the NVA commander knew that a conventional war was impossible to win and focused on winning over the people through an extensive propaganda network. Despite being bombed almost every hour, the Vietnamese forces were effectively using the Ho Chi Minh Trail to move large amounts of supplies through neutral Laos. It was believed that the attrition strategy was successful and was predicting an imminent end to the war, but in reality, the NVA was gaining ground, ultimately leading to America's defeat. Napalm was a weapon heavily used by the United States during the Vietnam War. It was a highly flammable gel made out of gasoline and a thickening agent so it stuck to anything it came in contact with, making it incredibly effective at burning through buildings, vegetation, and even human skin. The US military dropped thousands of gallons of napalm on Vietnam, primarily used in bombing raids to clear out the dense jungle and destroy villages thought to be harbouring Viet Cong fighters. The use of napalm was highly controversial as it resulted in the deaths and injuries of countless civilians, as well as causing severe environmental damage. The images of burned and disfigured civilians, particularly children, were widely circulated and contributed to the growing anti-war sentiment in the United States. The use of napalm was banned by the UN in 1980, but it is still produced and stockpiled by many countries. By 1968, the US illusion of imminent victory was shattered by the Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive was a coordinated military campaign launched by the National Liberation Front and the North Vietnamese Army on January 30th, 1968. The offensive was launched against the South Vietnamese government and its main ally, the United States, during the Vietnamese holiday of Tet, which marks the Lunar New Year. The NLF and NVA targeted over 100 cities and towns in South Vietnam, including the capital, Saigon. The offensive was a surprise to both the South Vietnamese and American forces, and it quickly spread across the country. The Tet Offensive was a major turning point in the war, as it dealt a significant blow to the US hopes of winning. Despite the fact that the NVA were eventually driven back, the offensive exposed the fragility of the South Vietnamese government and the vulnerability of the US-backed military. The scale and scope of the offensive revealed to the American public and military leaders that the war in Vietnam would be much more difficult than they had previously thought. The Tet Offensive also dealt a significant blow to the morale of the US soldiers, as well as the American public, who had been told that the war was almost won. The offensive made it clear that the war was far from over, and that the US was in for a long and difficult fight. The US's decision to withdraw from the Vietnam War was a gradual process that occurred over several years. By the late 1960s, the war had become deeply unpopular among the American public, as the conflict dragged on without any clear victory in sight. The Tet Offensive that I previously mentioned dealt a devastating blow to the American morale and shattered the illusion of imminent victory. Additionally, the leaking of the Pentagon Papers, which revealed such atrocities as the My Lai massacre and the true extent of the US involvement in the war, further eroded public support for the conflict. As the war dragged on and the death toll continued to rise, calls for an end to US involvement grew louder. President Richard Nixon, who took office in 1969, had campaigned on a promise to end the war, but his efforts to negotiate a peace settlement with North Vietnam were unsuccessful. In 1973, a ceasefire agreement was reached and the US officially withdrew its combat troops, but fighting continued until the fall of Saigon in 1975. The US government's decision to withdraw was ultimately driven by a combination of factors, including public pressure, the high cost of the war, and the lack of progress in achieving victory. The US involvement in the Vietnam War is now seen as a controversial and decisive chapter in American history. Many view it as a costly and unnecessary conflict that resulted in the loss of many American and Vietnamese lives, and caused significant political, social, and cultural upheaval in the US. Critics argue that the war was based on flawed strategic assumptions and the US military tactics, including the use of napalm and Agent Orange, caused unnecessary civilian casualties and environmental damage. Supporters of the war, however, argue that it was a necessary effort to contain the spread of communism in Southeast Asia and to defend American interests and allies in the region. The legacy of the Vietnam War continues to be debated and studied, and its impact on both the US and Vietnam is still felt today.